never liked visiting cemeteries, not because they scared me, but because they felt too heavy with sorrow. My younger sister, Emily, was the opposite. She had an odd fascination with them, always wanting to explore the history behind old graves, reading the names etched into stone, imagining the lives those people had once lived. That summer, Emily and I took a road trip through Georgia, stopping at old towns and historic sites. Savannah was our last stop, and Emily insisted we visit Bonaventure Cemetery before leaving. "It's beautiful at sunset," she said, clutching her camera, "and it's famous for ghost stories." I rolled my eyes. "We're leaving tomorrow morning, Em. Do we really have to?" Her determined expression told me there was no arguing. So, just before sunset, we drove down the winding road leading to the cemetery, the Spanish moss hanging from the trees like curtains, casting long shadows over the graves. As we wandered the cemetery, Emily snapped pictures of the statues and old tombstones, while I mostly just followed, hands stuffed in my pockets. The place was eerily quiet. The deeper we walked, the more isolated I felt. There was something off about the air, something heavy, almost suffocating. Emily was ahead of me, standing near a massive oak tree, staring at something. "Look at this statue," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I walked closer and saw what she meant. A life-size statue of a woman kneeling, hands clasped, her face contorted in sorrow. It was unsettling, the details almost too lifelike. The streaks on her cheeks made it seem as if she had been crying for centuries. "She looks real," I muttered. Emily took a step back, raising her camera. "Let me get a shot." Before she could finish, the air around us shifted. A cold breeze passed through, though the trees above us were completely still. And then we heard it. A soft, mournful sob. Emily's eyes snapped to mine. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The crying grew louder, echoing through the cemetery like it came from all around us. My stomach twisted as I scanned the area. There was no one there. And then, just beyond the statue, I saw her. A woman stood beneath the oak tree, her back to us, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. Her shoulders shook with heavy sobs, and her hands clutched at her chest like she was in unbearable pain. The longer I stared, the colder I felt. Emily whispered, "Who is that?" The woman took a step backward. No, not backward. She floated. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip ice cold. "We need to go." But I couldn't move. Something about her held me in place, an overwhelming wave of sorrow crashing over me, suffocating me. My mind filled with thoughts that weren't mine. Loss, grief, an unbearable longing for someone who would never return. I felt my knees weaken. The woman turned. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, with hollow eyes that locked onto mine. Black tears ran down her cheeks, staining the front of her gown. Her lips trembled as she whispered something I couldn't understand, her voice so fragile it barely carried in the air. And then she reached for me. I gasped as a cold, unseen force wrapped around my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My vision darkened at the edges. My own grief, memories of losing my mother years ago, rushed back, amplified 100 times. It felt like she was feeding on my sorrow. Emily screamed, "Let him go!" Somewhere in my fading consciousness, I felt her yank me back. My lungs filled with air as I staggered away, falling to the ground. The woman let out a wail, high-pitched and unnatural, before she vanished. Just gone. I don't remember how we made it back to the car, only that Emily half dragged me there. I was shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. We never spoke about it again, but I know Emily saw her too. A week later, she sent me one of the photos she had taken that night. In the background, just behind the statue, was the shadowy outline of a woman. She was watching us. I was working late that night, later than I should have. The office was empty by the time I packed up my things, and by then, the streets of Glendale were nearly silent. I had parked a few blocks away, and I figured cutting through the cemetery would shave a few minutes off my walk. Stupid decision. Forest Lawn is massive, more like a park than a cemetery, with rolling hills, grand mausoleums, and statues standing like silent sentinels. Even at night, it didn't seem too eerie, at least not at first. Streetlights from the nearby road cast a faint glow over the landscape, and the air was warm with the lingering heat of the California summer. I wasn't alone in the cemetery. At first, I thought it was just my nerves playing tricks on me, but as I walked past a cluster of graves, I saw movement. A man stood among the tombstones a few yards away, dressed in an old gardener's uniform, dark slacks, a buttoned-up shirt, and a cap pulled low over his face. He was raking the ground slowly, methodically. I hesitated. It seemed strange for a cemetery worker to be out this late, but I figured maybe he was on the night shift. I nodded at him in greeting. He stopped. Not just his raking. He went completely still. His head lifted ever so slightly, but the shadow from his cap kept his face hidden. A cold unease crawled up my spine. Something about him felt wrong. I hurried my pace, trying to shake the discomfort. The path ahead curved through a row of tall trees, and as I turned, I glanced back over my shoulder. The gardener was gone. The rake, however, was still there, standing upright, planted in the soil. My breath hitched. I hadn't heard him leave. No footsteps, no sound of the rake being set down. I walked faster. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The night bugs had stopped chirping. Even my own footsteps felt muted. I checked my phone, but the signal had vanished. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate scrape of metal against dirt. I spun around. The gardener was back. Only now he was closer. A lot closer. He stood barely 10 feet away, gripping his rake, his head still dipped low. He wasn't moving. But the sound continued, the scrape of the rake against the soil. That was when I realized the sound wasn't coming from him. It was behind me. I turned, heart pounding. A second rake, identical to the one the gardener held, was dragging itself through the dirt. No hands, no one holding it. It moved as if guided by an invisible force, carving long, deep lines into the ground. A gust of icy wind shot through me. That was when the gardener lifted his head. His face, if you could call it that, was a hollow, sunken void, like the skin had been stretched too tightly over his skull. His mouth twisted open, revealing blackened teeth, and though his lips never moved, I heard the words clear as day. "You don't belong here." I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted through the cemetery, weaving between headstones, desperate to find an exit. The air felt thicker, heavier, like something unseen was pressing against me. And then I saw them. Rows of figures stood among the graves, barely visible in the darkness. They weren't moving, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I pushed forward, my lungs on fire. A gate appeared in the distance, just past a sloping hill. I was almost there. But then, the ground beneath me crumbled. I fell forward, landing hard on my hands and knees. My fingers dug into the dirt, except it wasn't just dirt. It was loose, freshly dug soil. like a grave that had been prepared but never filled. A shadow loomed over me. The gardener. He was right there, inches away, the rake gripped tightly in his hands. I scrambled backward, but my body felt sluggish, like something was dragging me down. The figures in the distance, closer now, began to move. I thought that was it, that I wouldn't make it out. Then, out of nowhere, a blinding light flooded the cemetery. A car, headlights slicing through the dark. The moment the light hit him, the gardener recoiled, his form twisting, distorting like smoke in the wind. The figures scattered, dissolving into the shadows. I didn't wait to see what happened next. With the last of my strength, I pulled myself up and ran. I burst through the cemetery gates and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I never looked back. I never tried to explain it. I just left. It was supposed to be simple. I worked in historical restoration, fixing up old monuments, gravestones, and structures. The Preservation Society wanted me to document the state of some older tombstones, note any repairs needed, and take photographs for their records. It sounded easy enough. I had worked in plenty of cemeteries before, places steeped in history, sometimes tragedy, but never anything unnatural. This one was different. From the moment I stepped inside, an overwhelming silence hung over the place. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but something unnatural. The occasional bird call or rustling of leaves felt distant, muffled. Even my own footsteps sounded swallowed by the air around me. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my own overactive imagination. The cemetery itself was old, weathered gravestones leaning at odd angles, some with their inscriptions faded into near illegibility. I started my work, jotting down notes and snapping photos. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just erosion, dark smudges and irregular patterns in the stone. But the longer I stared, the more I realized these weren't natural formations. They were faces. Twisted, hollow-eyed faces, mouths stretched wide in silent agony. I rubbed my eyes, blinked a few times. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but no matter which angle I looked from, the faces remained. And then I noticed something worse. They were all looking at me. A chill crawled up my spine. I took a step back, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Then I heard it. A whisper. It came from behind me, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. The cemetery was empty. Then I heard another, and another. Dozens of whispering voices, overlapping, filling the air like a swarm of invisible insects. I turned back to the gravestones. The faces had changed. Their mouths had stretched open wider, and the expressions of pain had deepened. And then they screamed. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard. High-pitched, inhuman, like metal scraping against bone. The noise tore through my skull, vibrating in my chest, making my vision blur. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't just sound. It was inside me. The ground beneath me trembled. A low, groaning noise filled the air, like the earth itself was shifting. Then, right in front of me, the dirt began to sink, crumbling inward like something was dragging it from below. I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching in horror as a skeletal hand broke through the soil, fingers curling like claws. Then another, and another. Something was coming up. The whispers turned into wails, the voices overlapping in a frantic, desperate cry. The faces on the tombstones twisted, eyes widening, mouths contorting as if they were warning me. Then the thing started to pull itself out of the earth. A sunken face, skin stretched too tight over its bones, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. It let out a ragged, gurgling breath, its lips peeling back over rotting teeth. That was enough for me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but none of it mattered. I sprinted past gravestones, nearly tripping over uneven ground. My only thought to get out. The whispers followed me, rising and falling in a distorted chorus. The last thing I heard before I reached the gate was a voice, deep and guttural. Not human. Leave. I did. I don't know how I made it home. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. For days, I avoided looking at the photos I had taken, too afraid of what I might see. But curiosity got the best of me. I opened my phone, scrolling through the images. The faces on the gravestones were gone. The screaming expressions I had seen in person were completely missing. The stones were blank, weathered, but ordinary. And then I got to the last photo. There, in the background, just beyond the gravestones, a figure, standing in the shadows, watching. I don't take freelance cemetery jobs anymore.